Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming. Welcome to this press conference of the Economic and Social Research Council Future of the UK and Scotland programme at the University of Edinburgh. A bit of a mouthful, but it's been a major programme of academic research focused on the referendum. I'm Charlie Jeffrey from the University of Edinburgh and have been coordinating that programme right through the momentous events of yesterday and into the coming months as we begin today to digest the outcome of yesterday's vote. Just a quick reminder, not that it's really needed, I guess, of the basics. Yesterday we had an extremely high turnout for UK circumstances at 84.2% of the eligible electorate. My sense is, Nicola will correct me if I'm wrong, that that's the highest ever national turnout in Scotland, beating the previous record back in 1951, so something pretty extraordinary. Also extraordinary, I think, was the way that the referendum was conducted, a highly emotive set of issues, but really a pristine electoral process with very, very few spoilt ballots, 0.1%, and very, very few problems at the polls. I think I remember hearing of about 15 problematic ballots found last night in Scotland, which is, I think, an extraordinary achievement by the elections administration. The results, 55% no, 45% yes. We saw a swing away from yes as the referendum day approached, and on polling day, a poll was issued after voting had stopped last night, which showed 54-46, which wasn't that far away from the end result. The yes side was ahead in only 4 of 32 local authority areas in Scotland. 45% of the vote was less than some might have expected, given the way the opinion polls moved in the 10 days or so before the referendum, with one famous poll putting yes ahead at 51% to 49%. I think that poll has been responsible for what you might call a constitutional chain reaction. That poll which put yes ahead encouraged the pro-union side, in the voice of Gordon Brown, to publish a timetable for the development of firm legislative proposals on additional devolution for Scotland, which would be complete prior to the next UK election in March 2015, March next year. A timetable the Prime Minister confirmed this morning, also appointing Lord Smith of Kelvin to coordinate the process of generating those proposals. We also saw additional guarantees before, on the penultimate day, on the funding of the Scottish Parliament. The current funding system was guaranteed. As a result of these commitments on further Scottish devolution and of guarantees for the funding of the Scottish Parliament, there were concerns expressed by various politicians in England and in Wales about the perceived advantages that Scotland would have if Scotland voted no and stayed within the Union. Those concerns appear to have led to further elements of the chain reaction in the commitment of the Prime Minister this morning to introduce English votes for English laws in the House of Commons on the same timetable as the delivery of new powers for the Scottish Parliament. English votes for English laws means special procedures in the House of Commons for dealing with business which affects England only, of which there is a growing amount as other matters are carried forward in the devolved legislatures of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We also heard a commitment from the Prime Minister this morning, expressed in slightly vaguer terms, to implement proposals made recently for additional powers for the National Assembly for Wales. This is a series of reactions which is certainly improvised, I think also ill thought through, and amid that improvisation and minimal forethought, may well produce, especially in the case of England, a radical revision of the territorial constitution of the UK, which we could barely have imagined 2 days ago. We have seen an extraordinary situation in which a referendum on whether or not Scotland should be an independent country has led to the prospect of significant change in England and perhaps Wales, a rather bizarre ending point for this process. We have a series of experts here to answer any questions that you may have on all of that. On my immediate right, Professor Ailsa Henderson of the University of Edinburgh, who is an expert on voting behaviour and will be able to throw some insights into how and why Scotland voted as it did. On my left, Professors Nicola McEwen, University of Edinburgh, Michael Keating, University of Aberdeen, but also the Directorate of the Scottish Centre for Constitutional Change here at the University of Edinburgh. Both will be able to talk about the emerging proposals for further Scottish devolution and the challenges these might face in their implementation. On my outside right, David Bell, Professor of Economics, University of Stirling. The proposals for further Scottish devolution centre on tax devolution and devolution of elements of welfare policy. David will be able to talk about the economic and policy implications of those proposals. I'm happy to talk about the English spillover effects, and in a masterpiece of timing, our good friend and colleague, Professor Richard Wynne-Jones from Cardiff University, may well also be able to add some insights about the spillover effects of this constitutional chain reaction in Wales. We have a couple of colleagues with microphones who will enable you to be heard. And if anybody wishes to ask a question of any of us, please do. Please direct your question at whoever you think might be most appropriate, or if you don't, I will. So who'll be first? At the front, please, Ronnie.
Do you think the timetable can be achieved?
Nicola.
No. But I think it will be very difficult. It's possible that the income tax devolution elements of the proposals could be achieved, but only, I think, if the parties agree on the lowest common denominator, which is the Labour Party proposals, partly because it's easier to agree at the lower end than at the upper end for political reasons, but also because those proposals essentially build on what's already in the Scotland Act 2012. So the mechanism for transferring that degree of income tax devolution is already in process, if not yet in place. The welfare aspects, I think, are much, much more problematic. There is no detail offered yet as to how a system of social security could be disentangled. There are all sorts of questions around that, which we can maybe go into later, but I think that's particularly problematic. And that's just on the technicalities of it. There are big political issues as well, which may also pose problems for the timetable and the implementation. And locking this together with the English issue, as appears to have been the case, adds a further political hurdle which might affect the timetable.
Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, the deadline cannot be met and should not be met because this package of proposals, which is indeed very vague, was cooked up in the last week of the campaign when 20% of the people had already voted because they had postal votes. It purports to be the third way, which was ruled out in the Edinburgh Agreement, and it was put together by 3 party leaders at Westminster when we'd had 2 years of intense discussions in Scotland about where we would go and the implications for taxes and economic affairs and social welfare of various constitutional options. So there's extraordinary way to go about making politics, but possibly a typically British muddle through. After the vote, they proposed to put this through the Westminster Parliament by agreement with 3 Westminster parties. There is a constitutional convention that changes in the powers of the Scottish Parliament should be agreed by the Scottish Parliament and therefore implicitly negotiated with the Scottish Parliament. Now, it really surprised me this morning that Alex Salmond said, we want to keep you to that timetable, because I would have expected him to say, sit down and talk about it, because we have a point of view as well, and maybe this is not what we want, and maybe there's a poison chalice in some of these proposals. One thing that this referendum campaign has established is that when we're having a constitutional change, we need to have an intense public debate, which we've had in the last 2 years, looking at all the ins and outs of it and a mature deliberation. This looks like an old-fashioned Westminster fix and not the new kinds of politics we thought we were getting as a result of the referendum. So I find it highly problematic.
Okay, so Nicola says not very feasible and Michael says highly problematic. Anybody else have a question on that or any other matters? You got another one. Go on, go on.
So what will be, you know, the reaction of the people if what is being promised hasn't got any realistic base?
Ailsa, you have been following public opinion and more generally the way the public have engaged in the campaign in Scotland. What's your view on that?
In terms of how the public will react to the proposals at all? Well, I mean, 2 years ago when we had the Edinburgh Agreement, at that moment, devolution max, or some enhanced form of devolution, was the clear preference of most voters. It was the plurality option. People preferred that more than they preferred independence. It was more preferable to the status quo. And with the Edinburgh Agreement, that no longer became an option for the referendum. So going into this 2 years ago, we knew that that's what people wanted. And that has not changed throughout the campaign until we stopped asking. And we started to see also a rise in support for independence in the last 2 months, I would say. We know that if we ask people to design a system from scratch, you know, who do you think should have control over this, that, or the next thing, then the architecture they describe is very much a devolution more or devolution max scenario. In fact, many voters find devolution max too extreme for them. So certainly there would be an appetite for some form of enhanced devolution, but it does seem perverse that it has arrived possibly in this way. We can also, we have some sense also of how this would be received outside Scotland within the UK, and certainly both politicians and voters in particularly England and Wales are displeased with the idea that Scotland would get powers that they would not, which I think is why David Cameron came out today and suggested that the arrangement could be slightly more symmetrical than he had at first suggested. But deep scepticism from both Welsh and English politicians and from voters, and you can understand why.
Thank you. We may well come to Richard Wynne-Jones to tell us a little bit more about Wales.
Just how much the people of Wales would disagree.
In a moment. Or Richard, would you like to contribute on that point? Okay, he's holding that one back. I don't think for too long, knowing Richard.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask a question perhaps of Professor Jeffrey. It's more about your own work, actually, because you said that this was an ill thought through improvisation that's happening now. And in many ways, as an academic, how do you, I guess, untangle that and keep up with it and you know, analyze it and hold it to account when it seems to be kind of being played out through the media rather than through analytical thought?
It certainly is a challenge when one is confronted by such improvisation. It was very interesting to see when there was a perceived need for action to placate opinion in England, that the report of the Moray Commission on the Consequences of Devolution for the House of Commons, of which I was a co-author, was suddenly hoiked out of the long grass to which it had been consigned and called by the Prime Minister a very good report, which is something he conspicuously failed to say at the time we published it. It really is rather difficult for academics to inform such a process. There is the basis to think about a sensible system for modifying the procedures of the House of Commons to deal with English business differently. I don't think there is a systematic process which has led to the place that we are at.
Can I just add something to that? We have a second phase of our own project following the referendum, which is about where we go next. We have a meeting next month to launch this, which is going to be looking at taxation powers, welfare powers, the relationship amongst taxation, welfare, labour market policy, education and so on, and where Scotland could be and what kind of powers might be appropriate. And we would certainly appreciate it if the political parties gave us just a few months to think about that and think about the implications of these proposals. Because what the three parties have proposed in their previous discussions, which have been wrapped together, is in many ways really quite incoherent and it would not make good, coherent public policy. If they pushed through the Labour Party proposals, for example, they would have to revisit them within a year because they just wouldn't work, frankly.
Is there a danger, perhaps, that if it is cooked up and improvised, that it's not evidence-based?
Exactly.
That's kind of what I mean.
Exactly.
This is not actually based on anyone's work. It's just a political reaction to something.
I mean, this is a reaction which is in a sense characteristic of the way the UK state deals with its territorial challenges, which is to deal with each territory of the UK in a discrete way without thinking of the knock-on consequences of the whole. We're just seeing a much more compressed timetable for this than we would normally see.
I mean, one thing I think it's worth adding is that the original argument for why devolution max or devolution more shouldn't appear on the ballot is that it's a multilateral issue that affects each constituent part of the UK, and it is inappropriate to fundamentally change something in a bilateral way. So, you know, with the UK government agreeing to abide by the wishes of the Scottish electorate if that is the option that they prefer. So a bilateral arrangement is not a good way to enact something that is by its very nature a multilateral issue. What has happened now is that it has not been multilateral, it has not even been bilateral, it has been unilateral from the UK government, just sort of saying, well, this is what we've decided you would like, which I think people both in Scotland and in England and in Wales would find a little troubling.
Okay, any further questions? There we go, thank you.
Vivian Oswald from the Brazilian newspaper O Globo. We saw 45 people voting against the union. Could it mean a crisis, a Britishness crisis? I mean, people do not feel that British to vote for the union.
Elsa, I think that's you.
Yeah. I mean, we do know a little bit about national identity and preferences. So we've been looking at demographics, what might make someone more likely to vote yes or no. We know gender matters, age, social class, the region you live in. We know deprivation matters. identity and where you were born exist in a kind of strange relationship. We certainly know that if you were born in Scotland, you're more likely to have supported the Yes campaign. If you were born in England, you were less likely than if you were born outside of the UK. But both of those groups are more likely to vote no. But identity is a tricky one. If you described yourself as Scottish only, then you were more likely to vote yes. But many people in Scotland describe themselves as Scottish more than British. They retain an element of Britishness to their identity, or equally Scottish and British, or even prioritise their sense of Britishness, but retain some element of Scottishness. So on the one hand, the group that is distinct is the group that feels absolutely no sense of Britishness, but that is not the majority of Scots. The majority of Scots do have some element of Britishness to their identity. So that's one thing. And the second thing is national identity does have an impact. We know when we look at what makes someone vote yes or vote no, that national identity matters. But it matters a lot less than we might think, and it matters a lot less than your attitudes to the campaign, whether you liked Alex Salmond, for example, is far more important than whether you feel Scottish or British. Whether you thought you were going to get to use the currency, the pound, if Scotland became independent. Whether you thought Scotland might get into the EU under similar terms and conditions if it became independent. Whether you thought that spending cuts would be inflicted on the Scottish Parliament if Scotland remained within the UK. Those issues were far more important than national identity. National identity was important, but it was not the determining factor in whether someone voted yes or no. And national identity was more important than any of the demographics we look at. We know that demographics matter if we're just looking at them one at a time. We just look at gender, we see differences between men and women. If we just look at age, we see differences across the age groups. But if we start to look at all of these things together, then they all start to cancel each other out. And it's how you feel that matters, rather than the labels that you would attach to yourself.
Love more the union than they did until now, or something like that, something cultural aspects or other things?
The UK government, whether the UK government should do something to make people feel more British. I think any effort by the UK government to make people feel more British would likely backfire. I think the less and I'm speaking from experience because I know the Canadian government has attempted to do that in Quebec through various ways, and each attempt has backfired, both in terms of sponsoring cultural events or sticking Canadian flags everywhere. Every effort has not yet worked, which is not to say that there is not a successful formula out there, but certainly, given the campaign, I'm not convinced that it would be an easy one for them to find in the near future.
Thank you. Who's next? Please.
In the question of voting pattern also, what's the reason of people at the end voting for no when at the polls before the election it seems they're going to vote yes, no?
Yeah.
It was really inside the poll station that the decision was taken?
Yeah, I mean, people have been asking me, is anything surprising in here? And I must say, I was surprised by the size of the gap between support for the yes and support for the no. And there's a couple possible explanations. We won't really know more until we get our hands on some of the data we've been collecting. But one hypothesis is that many of those people who said they were undecided really weren't undecided. They were that silent minority that were always intending to vote no, but just didn't feel it was appropriate to say it, or didn't even want to believe it, possibly. So there's that hypothesis. We know that when we asked the question slightly different ways, we were able to figure out a little bit more about those people who said they were undecided when we asked the stark referendum question. And when we played around with that, we realized that the people who said they were undecided were, in fact, leaning towards the yes all along, but that yes voters were always less likely to stick with their vote choice. So undecideds in the dying days of the campaign were breaking 2-1 for the yes, but yes voters were more likely to switch to change their minds. And the YouGov poll confirms that. So the poll conducted on polling day was a panel of people it had already polled. They knew how people had said they were going to vote, and then when they asked them how they did in fact vote, the change in the gap between yes and no is partially explained by the fact that yes voters ended up voting no.
What about women and Labour voting at the end, the groups of...
Yeah, what we know of women is that they were always less likely to vote yes, but they were never in the polls more likely to say they were voting no. They were more likely to say they were undecided. And our assumption at the time was that was partly because women were taking longer to make up their minds, and women were less likely to tell pollsters when they had made up their minds. And again, we on the basis of the vote, we can't make any assumptions of that because we don't have constituencies that have very few percentages of, a very small proportion of women and local authorities with a very high proportion of women that would allow us to figure out what was going on at the aggregate level. In terms of party ID, we do know a little bit, but that's bound up a little bit with indices of deprivation and social class. So we know that the yes side was doing better in areas that were more deprived according to the SIMD index, and when we created our little indicators to help us identify the bellwether ridings, the bellwether riding, if we took into account proportion of British-born and index of multiple deprivation and British identity, the bellwether riding was Fife. And so we were waiting all night for Fife to declare because we figured Fife would give us the clue about how the entire nation would vote. And of course, Fife became critical in the end, but only because that's what tipped the balance into no finally voting. But if you look at Fife's result, it is exactly the national result.
So it was the bellwether. We just had to wait until right at the end. I'm going to bring David Bell in on public attitudes, but I'd also like to ask David, as he speaks, to comment on the proposals and timetables for additional Scottish devolution. Nicola called them unfeasible, Michael called them problematic, Ailsa called them perverse. I wonder if we can get the full set from you.
Okay, let me talk a little bit about the opinion polls and the outcome. First of all, there's a piece in the New York Times today by Justin Wolfers, who's researched what are called prediction markets for a long time. And this is the notion, actually, that you will get at least as good a guess at the outcome of an electoral competition by looking at the betting odds. And so I have followed the betting odds on this for some time, and I think not all that many people have paid very close attention to the betting odds, but in fact, they were far better predictors of the outcome than the majority of the opinion polls. They were far more stable. The opinion polls suffered from differences due to the way they sample, the way they weight, the way they ask the question even. So the theory behind the reason why betting odds work is because people are putting their own money on the line and they use every possible piece of information that they can to assess the potential outcome. And so basically I could see those odds respond to, for example, Mr. Osborne's statement about the currency, and then the second of the TV debates, which by all, well, it's acknowledged that Mr. Salmon won quite significantly, and for both of these, there was a pretty significant reduction in the chance of no winning, but it never, ever dropped below 60%. It never went to evens. And maybe, if, as Charlie said, that they'd looked at these odds rather than that one YouGov poll, we wouldn't be thinking about changing the Constitution now. So then we looked at also what the margin that was being bet on, what it was, and I tweeted yesterday that I thought it would be 46-54, and it wasn't far out from that, and that's just based on who was betting on what kind of, like, there was a lot of bets on 40 to 45, 45 to 49, and other ranges, and you just weight these all together, and the middle of that range was 46. So anyway, that's a take on the outcome on the opinion polls. So on the question of the additional tax powers and their delivery, as we've discussed, the issue of looking at things on a multilateral basis rather than a bilateral or indeed a unilateral basis is not well founded in the UK. What we've got at the moment, or what so far we've been told at the moment, just seems incoherent. There are different possibilities out there. Now, I was involved in the Kalman Commission expert group, which looked at across the well, first of all, it set out a set of principles which you would like a devolved tax system to adhere to, and then we went through all of the potential taxes and tested them against those principles. And it becomes quite difficult for all kinds of reasons to say, well, we'll have all of these taxes and give the Scottish Parliament jurisdiction over all of them. There's a set, so that work exists, and I suspect it will also be being dusted down in the pretty immediate future. There's also the Merrilies Commission, which has looked at the tax structure of the UK as a whole. Coincidentally, so James Merrilies is on the Council of Economic Advisors to the Secretary of State for Scotland. That's a piece of work done by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. But this is not easy. Divvying up from a very centralized taxation system to a way effectively more like a federal system, while still maintaining equity, while still not having tax competition between areas, and still trying to figure out how you compensate areas that have shortfalls in their revenue gathering powers, and how you deal with that kind of issue is extremely complex. The timetable for that is desperately short, and I cannot see that being effectively done over the timetable that we've got. I mean, the Labour Party, so we do already have powers coming on stream next year in relation to income tax. So most of the focus has been on income tax and the extension of control over income tax. That will seem very lopsided, and as Charlie says, this is really top-down politics. You know, this is the instrument that you are allowed to control. And, you know, I don't think there was ever great buy-in into the proposals for the Scotland Act 2012, although they may have been, in a kind of bilateral sense, quite sensible. But there's certainly a problem of political buy-in to these issues that are in themselves inherently technical and difficult to communicate.
Okay, thank you. We've got the full set. David said incoherent among the other words used by our colleagues. Nicola had an addendum to the latest
I do.
discussion.
I mean, I agree with my colleagues that that YouGov poll set off some sort of chain reaction, but what it did was introduce a timetable. The proposals were already there, and I think staging the referendum in the way that they did, the gamble that the Scottish Government took was that they would get over probably a 40% hurdle. Below that, then they may have faced political problems. Above that, it was always going to be a win-win. So they had already moved all of the three UK political parties further down the constitutional road towards enhanced self-government. 2 years before the last set of proposals are even introduced. So already the Scotland Act 2012 was out of date, and we haven't even seen how it will be implemented in full. So I want to just not over-exaggerate the significance of that poll. I think it led to the timetable which will lead to further problems in implementation and further political problems for the UK government in particular in trying to honour that timetable. But the proposals themselves predated that, and the dynamic of Scottish self-government continues as a result of the referendum.
Okay, thank you. The honourable representative from Wales has stirred. Could somebody give him a microphone? Richard Winjo.
Thank you. I'm impressed by your ability to speak cogently with so little sleep. One of the striking things from a Welsh perspective about the Scottish process of constitution making is that it's been done on a kind of intra-unionist basis. So the unionist group in Scotland has produced the various proposals which have then been implemented and so on and so forth, with the SNP either self-excluding at various stages or being deliberately excluded at other stages. And so I'm just thinking about moving ahead now. First of all, what do you think are the prospects of the SNP actually getting involved in a constitution-making process? Do you think that is actually feasible, and what would that mean? And secondly, and maybe given some of the remarks which we've heard this morning, are we actually going to see the unionist bloc remaining united on these issues? It seems to me that once England comes into the picture, the interests of the unionist parties are diametrically opposed. There have been some very, very virulent attacks today by Welsh Labour politicians against the proposals for England from the Conservatives. They've been accusing the Conservatives of balkanising Britain and all that kind of stuff. So are we going to see the unionist bloc actually fracture now? And again, what does that mean in terms of constitution making in Scotland? I know this is speculative, but be interested in your speculations.
Okay, so will the SNP play a role in developing the Scottish proposals, and will the unionist bloc stay united? I'm going to ask Michael to take first go at that. I do recall reading at some point this morning a tweet in the name of David Cameron which said that Alex Salmond had agreed to take part in multi-party talks, but I haven't seen that in any more formal way than Twitter. Michael?
No, all I saw from Salmond was he was demanding that the unionists implement their own proposals by their own timetable, which struck me as very odd, but maybe he's had time to reflect on it more fully. Yes, absolutely, the SNP must, and I think will be part of this discussion, because they're no longer isolated or isolating because they had an independence option. That's out of the game. It's all about forms of autonomy now. There was a very good intervention by Henry McLeish last night saying the Scottish Parliament should be the first place this is discussed. And the Scottish parties should get together and say this is what we want, and then go into negotiations with the United Kingdom. So that does imply the unionist bloc cease to exist, and there's a kind of Scottish bloc. Now, this is perfectly normal in places like, in the past, Quebec. Once the option of independence was off, then the Quebec National Assembly says, well, we have a common position, and we're going to stick together despite our internal differences. That's almost completely absent here, where the unionists have a single, seamless attitude from Westminster all the way down, and then the nationalists are apart. The main difficulty for the unionist bloc is not the living together or the coordination amongst the parties. It's the problem within the Labour Party, which is deeply divided about this. The Conservatives would find it much more easy to make concessions to Scotland because they've less to lose here, and because they haven't got this obsession with centralised welfare that the Labour Party has. But the Labour Party is divided, and always has been, between Home Rulers and centralists. That division keeps on coming back again. And listening to Gordon Brown, you're reminded of this fundamental contradiction between we're in favour of Home Rule, but anything whatsoever to do with welfare has to be centralised. And then Gordon Brown forgets that the health service is already devolved and says, well, the health service is part of that as well. That's something that Labour have got to sort out. And then there are notorious divisions between the Labour MSPs and the Labour MPs in Scotland, which are essentially institutional because they compete for the representation in Scotland. And then there are differences in the Labour Party as to the degree to which they're prepared to cooperate with other parties, because Labour is a very tribal party. Now, since Labour, along with the SNP, is one of the two dominant parties, Labour is the key to all of this. And that, I think, is the problem, is the Labour Party getting its act together. Now, at one point in the night, I had two senior Labour politicians in the same studio with me yesterday, and both of them were saying, it's not a constitutional question. This is just a protest vote. People want better houses and education. That's all it's about. And Labour will get in and deliver that. And then the question will go away again. Scottish nationalism will go away again. Now, I've been following this for over 40 years, and that's what they always say. So some people simply haven't got their minds around this, and the Labour Party is included there. The Liberal Democrats, who have a very interesting and honourable history of federalism, seem to have forgotten about it. Maybe that will revive as well. But I see that your point about the coherence of the unionist bloc, no, it's not going to hold together. That seems to be very, very difficult.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. A word?
Well, I think at about 7 o'clock this morning we saw the start of the general election campaign, and so that answers that particular question about the collapse of the unionist bloc. With respect to the SNP, I mean, I think in previous processes it was always going to be difficult. The Calman Commission was set up as a rival to the Scottish Government's national conversation. Its terms of remit were about strengthening the United Kingdom, so it was never going to be feasible for the SNP to engage as a partner in that process. Post-referendum, I think it is more possible. I would be astonished if the Scottish Government didn't start to define its own version of devolution max, if you like, and try to push the process on in that way. And I think the appointment of Lord Smith of Kelvin is probably quite significant given the relationship that was established with him for the Commonwealth Games. So that's someone that they already have a good working relationship with and a trusting relationship. So that would certainly facilitate the engagement of the Scottish Government.
Thank you. Who would like to pose the next question? We've got the lady at the front, and then we'll go back to Brazil in a moment.
Is today the first day on the step to federal UK? Federal.
Elsa.
No. I cannot see how federalism, classic federalism, could ever operate in the United Kingdom, given the disproportionate distribution of populations. Given the size of England, I just cannot see how it would work. The only way that you could get it to work in a classic sense, a classic symmetrical sense, would be if you devolved powers to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then regions within England. But we know that devolving powers to regions within England is not the most popular solution to the English problem in England. England would be quite happy, I think, with an English Parliament, or certainly we know that pockets of England would be very, very happy with that. But that would be a very difficult federal situation to have.
Just to amplify on that, with Ailsa and Richard Wynne-Jones, we have conducted research on public attitudes in England over the last few years, exploring different constitutional options. And of the various constitutional options available, regionalisation in England is the least popular option. It keeps getting revived in one way or another because people see it as a route to a symmetrical solution, but it has no popular resonance. We have come to call it the zombie proposal, because you think you've killed it off and then it just resurrects itself somehow. This is something which has no popular demand behind it. To Globo in Brazil, please.
I'd like to know what we can expect from now on for the European Union. Was the vote no good for the European Union? How this discussion about belonging to the European Union or not will continue from now on?
Michael.
The next big debates in the UK about constitutional matters will concern the European Union. I think Scotland will become a bit of a sideline in the next year or so, because in England, at least, there's a deep division about the European Union. Here there is a division, but it's rather shallow. And people here are a little bit Eurosceptic, but they don't have the same obsession they have in England. They don't demand that something should be done about it. If the Conservative Party win the next election in the United Kingdom in May, they promise there will be a referendum on the European Union in 2017, an in-out referendum, possibly on revised terms, although I'm not quite sure how they're going to get those terms, but that is what they promise. There is a real possibility, at least, that in such a referendum, England could vote to come out and Scotland would vote to stay in which case there would indeed be a connection, because we'd have to have another referendum in Scotland in order to stay in.
So when Alex Salmon said we would only have another independence referendum after a generation, in that circumstance, a generation could be quite short. Who's next? We may well be running out of questions. Go on then, one more.
So, what has been the role of Gordon Brown in this, you know, the new settlement, the new promises?
Michael.
Well,
Michael, then David.
all right, okay.
Gordon Brown is a very complicated person, and I've known him for a long time. He's a very complicated person. His intervention was clearly very effective. It gave a leadership and a passion, a coherence to the unionist message that was lacking. But on the other hand, some of the things he said were very strange. His book, which I reviewed and is on our website, had a very strong intellectual defense of the union. The first one I've really seen, because he is an intellectual and he thinks about these things very deeply. But in other ways, it was really quite contradictory, because he insists that the UK is a welfare union, that sharing and social solidarity can only take place at the UK level. And this includes everything, including devolved matters. He comes up with a very strange financial proposal that he says that 60% of the entire Scottish budget should be financed from reserved powers, because they more or less correspond to social solidarity and things that should be the same, including health and education. It's very odd. So he gave some kind of intellectual coherence, but his policy prospectus I find just very, very confusing indeed. The other fascinating thing I've found about Gordon Brown is the way he continually defines identity. He feels a need to define identity. We were talking about Britishness and whether it is desirable or possible to encourage Britishness, and I entirely agree with Ailsa that this would be counterproductive. But Gordon Brown, a little like Pierre Trudeau in his day, being a Scottish intellectual, Quebec intellectual governing the whole country, tried to essentialize Britishness in a way that simply destroys Britishness, because Britishness is a very pluralistic concept. That's how the union always worked. Britishness means different things in Northern Ireland from England and different things again in Scotland. But Gordon Brown was always trying to essentialize this. And then he tried also to essentialize Scottish values. Now, the SNP does a bit of this too. You appropriate universal values and you say those are our values. All nationalists do this. But Gordon Brown presents a notion of Scotland that really belongs back in the 1950s, when he and I were both children. And he talks about religion and Calvinism and the Presbyterian Church being somehow the root of all Scottishness. When Scotland has moved on, it's a multicultural society. There are the Irish, and then the Asian immigrants, and European immigrants, Eastern Europeans, and so on. So his notion of the union is a very cleverly articulated one, but it seems to me about 2 generations behindhand. And that's why people admire his passion, but he doesn't any longer push those right buttons. People don't instinctively respond to the message he's putting over, because it seems to me it's a message of a Britain of the past and not a Britain of the present.
Thank you. David?
I had a discussion with my wife last night about the word asunder, which appears in the speech, and it's straight out of the Old Testament. You know, it was.
We will be torn asunder.
Yeah, it was very much an Old Testament sermon that we were given, and of course, I think it did make a pretty significant difference. But it is harking back to a certain extent to those kinds of values with which I'm very familiar, but maybe are less familiar in the newer parts of Scotland. There is this issue too that Michael's referred to about, what is it that constitutes the kind of indivisible part of the union that should be funded centrally and the rest funded locally. And I think that, he seems to have come up with a solution that needs to be thought through quite a bit more. I don't think it's impossible. In fact, it has already been done to devolve fairly significant chunks of welfare without necessarily having adverse effects on the cohesion or the level of social insurance that different parts of the country have. So there's still quite a lot to work through, I think. I'm just not clear now what his role or his influence is going to be over this whole affair, whether he's going to step back now or not. I just don't know.
He did give a hint that he might wish to play a role in Scottish politics in the Scottish Parliament at one point near the voting day. We will see. Last chance. Anyone else? Oh, yes. Two last ones. Oh.
I'd like to go back to incoherence. When you talk about Salmon being incoherent and Gordon Brown in a way, Cameron was as well, since he used the same very arguments that he uses against the European Union inside England, he used to make Scottish people stay. So how can we explain that, and how was it seen by Scots?
Okay, the inconsistencies in understanding the Scottish challenge vis-à-vis the UK and the UK challenge vis-à-vis the EU.
Me? Oh, I don't think it was thought of, I think you're right, but I don't think it was perceived in that way. I think the dominant debate in Scotland is about Scotland's relationship with the UK. It's not about Scotland or the UK's relationship with the EU. So while I think the contradictions are evident, I don't think that necessarily influences people's perceptions.
Okay. Nick, you wanted to...
You've suggested there may be some issues with the process as indicated by David Cameron yesterday. What would you see as a more desirable or a more practical process going forward? People have mentioned the UK-wide constitutional convention. What issues should people be looking for in that process going forward from here?
Okay. David?
Well, I mean, so there's a whole bunch of technical stuff which has to be addressed and will take some time to deal with. But it does seem to me that there are some general principles that have to be established first. And in a way, it's what Gordon Brown was searching for. What are the elements of our identity, our existence, that are genuinely can be dealt with at UK level, and what would it be desirable to think about in a more local way. Now, you can't do the technical stuff until you have the principles, so it seems to me that those have to be addressed in the first instance. I would leave it maybe to my political experts on my left to decide what is the best form of dealing with that, whether a constitutional convention or what. But I mean, it might seem that other parts of the UK would feel that this has been foisted on them by this strange event that's happened north of the border. So I don't think it's going to be easy.
I think they'd probably be right. Just one additional point. I think what's been remarkable about the referendum campaign is the extent of civic engagement in Scotland in thinking about the collective future. I think the local, the grassroots level mobilisation, people discussing the issues in church halls, schools and elsewhere, has been quite astonishing. However, the process set out for achieving the draft legislation prior to the next UK election envisages about 3 weeks for consultation. And I think that is probably an inappropriate amount of time if one really wants to harness and continue those very, very creative energies that this referendum campaign has set forth.
Would that not suggest that one possible solution would be for political parties to campaign in the forthcoming UK general election on what they think the process, not the substance of the arrangement, but the process to arrive at the substance of the arrangement should be like?
Possibly, but they have now got themselves into the position where they have to deliver something before the general election, or risk a political consequence of not honouring what was apparently a solemn vow.
And solemn vows are very important.
Well, I think the Scottish Parliament should come into its own under these circumstances, because it's almost completely absent from these debates as an institution. We just have debates amongst parties. But the Scottish Parliament could set up a committee to examine this, take evidence, and that could be the centre of debate and try and reach some consensus there, at least some compromises amongst the forces in Scotland, and then think about negotiating with the other parts of the United Kingdom. I'm very sceptical about a UK constitutional convention because Elsa and I are both familiar with Canadian politics, and the agenda gets so overloaded that nothing ever gets done, and there are multiple veto points. I think that we've got to do some of this sequentially, as long as there's an internal coherence in the things that we're doing.
Just to reiterate a point Michael made at the start, which colleagues may not fully have appreciated. The timetable that Gordon Brown set out, and that has now been recognised in a more formal way by the Prime Minister, does not include a period for consideration of the draft legislation by the Scottish Parliament. Yet that legislation cannot ultimately be enacted without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, which raises both a question mark about process and about the feasibility of that timetable, but also, perhaps in line with where Michael was suggesting, leaves an opportunity for the Scottish Parliament itself to stake a claim and itself define what a sensible scheme of additional devolved powers might be. That might well be seen as a challenge from us to the Scottish Parliament.
Do you think after that the Scottish electorate has been deceived by these rash promises?
And I think the answer to that, and Nicola touched upon this a minute ago, is that it would be potentially very damaging for the parties which have agreed to these proposals not to deliver something, and therefore be presented as having deceived. So we might well be locked in to a timetable which is unfeasible, problematic, perverse and incoherent. I think we are probably coming to the end of our tethers after a long campaign, a long night last night. I am sure that if individual colleagues from the media would like to speak with one or other of us, then at least for a brief period afterwards we would be available to do so. But thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your time in Scotland.